discussion. This is the fourth in a series focusing on foreign policy, typically the Middle East and beyond. So today we have a very interesting discussion that we're going to have. It's about the future of special operations, a look at the capabilities, needs, and threats that we face. I want to thank Michael Ostrolenk for helping put this together and co-moderate the discussion. With us today, we have a wide group of eight people, and Herb London, president of the London Center for Policy Research, which is actually hosting this discussion, will speak with us. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, he is senior fellow and director of external communications for the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Jed Babbin, the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense in the George H.W. Bush administration. Arthur Herman will be here to discuss the, and he is a visiting fellow at AEI. Rob DuBois, a Navy SEAL, who's recently written a book. We'll be discussing from his point of view. Peter O'Brien from Naval Intelligence, Derek Leebaert, an author on these issues, as well as a professor at Georgetown for foreign policy. And Michael Ostrolenk will moderate this discussion. I think we'll open the discussion with some words from Herb.
Well, again, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and thank you very much for coming. Thank my colleagues. This is a very distinguished group. I'm very eager to hear their comments. Let me start by trying to give you a little perspective or background on this issue. In 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, the Pentagon was shocked at how quickly their tanks were mobilized and the force that the Soviets used at that time. It led to an interesting conversation in the Pentagon, one that I was very much involved in how would the United States respond to a European attack by the Soviets. And we came up with a strategy. The strategy was something called air-land battle. And air-land battle was something that was described for a considerable period. I spent a lot of time thinking about it and writing about it and did a book on air-land battle. And the reason why I bring it to your attention is the focus in air-land battle was for the United States to be far more resilient, even working in platoons, using special forces, and that we would be able to offset an obvious Soviet advantage with firepower, with the kind of resiliency that the United States would display. We went through an awful lot of analysis, and then we engaged in several games. In every game, the United States lost. Every single game that was played, we lost. Which was very interesting to me, because despite the tactical changes that were occurring and our discussion about the resilience of American forces, we could not offset the firepower that the Soviets had mobilized at that time. Now, why do I bring that to your attention? Special forces are very important, and I think a lot of emphasis has been put on them by General Petraeus and by this administration. Are they sufficient, however, to deal with the many disadvantages that we have on various battle fronts? And the answer to that is, I don't know. And the reason why I raised that question is despite the fact we had an awful lot of thinking that went into how we would oppose the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and air-land battle was the response, and it did lead to a lot of resilience, we could not in any of the games find a way to offset Soviet firepower. So I raise that as a cautionary note in this conversation. We're going to engage in a long discussion today about what air-land battle means circa 2013, but most significantly, what is the role of special forces and special forces play in offsetting the kind of threats that we are now facing. So I don't want to engage in overstating either the influence that special forces may have or the underestimating the role that they could play in considering the various threats that we have. So with that, my friend, then you could address the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ella. We're actually in an interesting transitional time. As we all know, we left Iraq, we're transitioning out of Afghanistan. We're also facing $16 billion in debt. So we all think it's time to step back and reflect on where we are and where we might be heading. And we brought this distinguished panel together to have this conversation, very specific to special operations. If you heard Alan McRaven recently state that we have special operations operating in 70 to 90 countries, it's obvious that in the more recent past and into the future, that will be our focus into the near future. In fact, we probably won't have land and air battles in the near future. Special operations will be kind of the cutting edge of how we do our military operations around the globe. And special operations play many different roles. For instance, they do training operations. We're training the Filipinos against Oversight in the Philippines. We're training the Syrian rebels in Jordan, allegedly. We're targeting the Lord's Resistance Army in the Congo. We have capture and kill operations in Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan. We have intelligence operations in Somalia, Mali, and Libya. We're also kind of securing man-pads in Libya and other such operations throughout the globe. So our special operations community is very busy. Today we're going to address 4 questions that these fine gentlemen are going to answer. The first question is, what are the real threats that we face? As I said, now is the time to kind of step back and look and determine and define the threats that we face. The second question is, what role does special operations community play in dealing with those threats? The third question we're going to answer is, what are the needs and capabilities of the special operations community? What do they need? What do they have? What role can we play, especially members of Congress, ensuring that they're funded to the fullest? And the fourth question is, what are the limitations to the special operations community? Mr. Herman raised that as a question as well. What are the tactical limitations, strategic and legal? And I also like to throw in oversight, because that has been an issue of concern among many policymakers as well. So why don't we open up with the first question, which is, what are the threats that we face? And why don't we start with Lieutenant Commander Tony Shaffer. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer.
Who wishes he was in there? Not your name. Good morning. Thank you for having us. Special Operations Forces, in my judgment, has become the tip of the spear for the purposes of protecting our nation right now. As specified in my judgment, the Special Operations Forces are a lot of places we need to be. And I would argue that while presence may not be protection, it is appropriately warranted. And I think that's part of the problem is we can't be everywhere we need to be necessarily, so therefore we have to maximize our ability to use intelligence information instead of that. Engagement with foreign nations, with the cooperative natures are important. Much of what we do comes out of the OSS. The OSS was that organization during the Cold War, during World War II, that developed the CIA and Army Special Operations Forces, Special Forces. That is what we need to focus on. About 2% of the budget right now comes out to support this, and I would argue that's probably the best place. We should probably fence that. Things like Abrams tanks are not something we should be focused on at this point in time. In my judgment, it's insane. We have 3,000 sitting in the desert. We can retool those. If you want to talk about production line, you can use that production line for other things besides tanks. I've been past Lima, Ohio. There's other things you can use with that production line. Trust me, it's an industrial base. We can change and go as we need to. With that said, we need to look at 3 things as threats. We need to look at nuclear deterrence. Nuclear weapons exist. We have to deal with that. Special Operations Forces do have a role in that. Special Operations Forces regarding cyber. Cyber issues are something we have to pay attention to. We've had exercises at the War College recently. That's something you don't need a large land army to do. Within the context also of Special Operations Forces, you need to have aggressive ability to do advanced force operations if necessary. That again is something we do very well. So with that said, I think we have a path forward. Sun Tzu once said, know yourself and know your enemy. That's the key to success. I would argue right now we don't know ourselves because we have this massive DOD, which spends more money than it even knows where it goes. And frankly, we don't understand our adversaries. Most of the cultures we deal with, and I deal with a lot in Afghanistan, we don't understand. We've never understood the culture in Afghanistan. That's why we have not been able to successfully shape that battle space. So we got to get back to the basics and understand this. So ultimately, the authorities. Title 10 can do a lot of things. What we do in the military, Title 10 is called Traditional Military Activities, TMA. That means basically anything George Washington did with the Continental Army, the Army and the military can do today. It's different than Title 50. Title 50 is the intelligence community's authorities, which are covert actions and things like that. The balance of the two are key and critical to understanding how to use properly the resources we have. And ultimately, resources should be within the constructs of a limited budget and doing offsets such as Abrams tanks. The Abrams tanks that we bought could fund special operations forces for 10 years. So this is where we have to look at what the threats really are, identify those threats, validate those threats, and match forces against those threats. And the ultimate issue is going to be natural resource competition, fuel, and other things like that. So ultimately, we need to focus on that as our primary issue, protecting the American people, making sure the American people are protected. Terrorism is the key. I'm not saying there's no terrorism out there. I'm saying there's larger issues we need to focus on over the next 10 years, which we need to actually leverage.
Great. Actually, why don't we just open it up? We're dealing with threats. What are the threats we face? I heard Tony talk about cyber, nuke, and its needs to deal with resource allocation protection as well.
If I may, and I'll throw this out, I don't disagree with anything Tony said, but someplace in here, before the nation deals with a detailed assessment of its threats, the nation is going to need to deal with an idea of where they want to go. I mean, if you don't know where you're headed, then you really don't know what the competition is. The competition, in a sense, is the threat. And at a certain point here, we need to have a clear understanding of what it is the nation is trying to do. Failing that, we default to the sort of the traditional responses, which is defend the United States, defend the U.S. interests, though that gets hard to define in the fine print. And defend our allies, defend our treaties, and then you have the nuclear weapon, WMD, threat, conundrum. But without a clarity on our part as to exactly how we define those things, allocating resources will in the end become very difficult, because we don't know which one is first, we don't know which one is second, we don't know how much we want to commit to it. So someplace in here, there is going to need to be a fairly strong dialogue among the American people, if you will, between its chosen elected leaders and the people themselves as to exactly what it is the United States is trying to do and what we want the world to look like. Failing that, it becomes virtually impossible to sustain any kind of plan, because a plan needs a goal.
Let me suggest there's a couple other aspects to that. One of the things that I've made a little study of, and I am convinced we are pretty much completely lacking, is a national strategy. Now, when you talk about a national strategy, okay, what are we going to do with special operations? Well, we can do anything we want to do. Whatever we ask them to do, the special operations guys will do it. I have ultimate confidence in that. However, what in blazes do we want them to do? What we need to have, as this gentleman is saying, we need to have a very serious discussion of what our national strategy is. And we don't have that right now. The defense guidance has not been done. The quadrennial defense review has, and some people may not want to hear this, the quadrennial defense review was conducted in a manner to fill in the blanks on the budget. It was not done with a serious intellectual analysis of what we need to do. What are the threats? So I go back to the old Reagan days, and what we had then was a process called defense guidance. What do? You take the very best intelligence that you possibly have and you try to define the threats as best you can. Then you look at the presidential toolbox. You got nukes, you got special forces, you got everything in between. And you try to compare them to what you need. And when you find a deficit, you might find an overage. You might find some things we don't need. And I'm totally with you on the idea. We don't need 3,000 tanks. But we have to make that decision. We have to make the comparison. The presidential toolbox has a finite number of things. It has intelligence, it has special ops, it has all the rest of these things. The basic bottom line is, unless and until we do the job of the defense guidance and have some literal national strategy to perform, we can't know what we're doing. The second portion that I'd like to add to this, and it's something that I've been rather exercised about for a very long time. There are people in the administration who apparently believe we will never fight another conventional war. Gates said it, I don't know how many times, I think back, oh gosh, way back to 2002 or 2003. Gates was saying, well, we are going to have this problem here with next war-itis. And he derided that as the tendency of the government, the tendency of the Pentagon to think about the futuristic weapons, the things that we need to fight the next war, not this war. Well, with due respect to Mr. Gates, what the hell is your job? Your job is to have next war-itis. Your job is to think of what we need to do. Your job is to say, we need this rather than that, and make a choice between the assets that we need. And again, assets are people, assets are airplanes, all sorts of things. But the problem we have is if we don't make those choices, we can't have a national strategy. We can't know what we're going to do. We can't have the means to meet the threats because we don't know really what they are. Now, you know, if someone I guess Rob Mugabe's no longer there, so he's no longer a good example. So, you know, Rob Mugabe would say, oh, death to America. Well, excuse me while I go on. But if someone, you know, like the late bin Laden might have said it, that's something you take seriously. The question is, what do you take seriously and what you don't? And what I see today is we don't know what is fact and what is muscle. We don't have the ability to tell the difference between what we need and what we really don't. And that is the problem we have. Unless and until we have that defense guidance done, unless we have a quadrennial defense review that is worth more than the paper it's printed on, that is not just something that is going to fill the blanks on the budget. That is the problem we're going to have and continue to have, and we won't be able to answer the question of what are the threats and what do we want to do with special operations, because we simply don't know.
But if I could jump in,
Sure.
to back up what you're saying. Between World War I and World War II, we faced a very similar set of circumstances. We were trying then to figure out what we needed to do next. And some of you have heard me, Pete and I have talked about this a lot. We came up with something called the Rainbow Plan. You can Google it, it's on the internet. And I'm proposing, some of you know, I'm working with the War College and stuff right now, is how did we figure out threat between wars? And that was called the Rainbow Plans. And the one that people focused on was something called Plan Orange, which was the plan to go against the Japanese. So people were thinking between the wars, being intellectually, looking at what the real threats were. So if, my goodness sake, if we could do it then, in the 20s and 30s, we can certainly do it now. And oh, by the way, we did cut back, but we were able to respond rapidly. And let's think about this. The war started in the Pacific in 41, and yet we were already leaning forward. Although we weren't prepared as probably we should have been, we were already leaning forward, and the industrial base was able to swap over rapidly. And think about what we did in 4 years. We won that war, we developed the Army, this Army, no offense to the Navy, developed the A-bomb from 42 to 45. Oh, the Navy did have a couple of guys helping out, so.
Yeah, the guy who set the fuse, by the way.
That's right. I'm the only guy stupid enough to do it.
Let me jump in here into the story. Plan Orange in the 1930s was a lot of fun. It was taken truly seriously. It also underscores the fact that America has no enduring friends. We might have clients, but let's not get too emotionally invested in who our friends around the world might be. Plan Orange assumed a Japanese invasion of the United States intended with the British Empire. Now, that might make us sit back and reflect how preposterous it was that we would go to war with the British Empire, but during the 1930s it seemed quite real to many people. Let me also add to Professor London's historical observations, because he reminds us that history can be a terrific lens to look at the subject of today. Special operations and Army Special Forces particularly got their start by trying to give the Republic resiliency in Europe against the evil empire. Army Special Forces were stood up in 1952 precisely for the purpose of waging guerrilla warfare behind the lines of the Red Army advance. But final historical thought, keep in mind the fluctuations in enthusiasm that Americans had for the special operators. Right now it's riding very high, movies, books, good people, and so forth. I would argue that that is extremely a temporary enthusiasm. We call the disappointments of Vietnam, just as we're going to be facing the disappointments of Iraq and Afghanistan. In 1973, the SEALs came within a whisker of being put on reserve status, all of them. We did not need the SEALs, nor do we need the Green Berets. We were cut from 12 special forces groups down to 3, and the remaining 3 were granted social work assignments in North Carolina. Chief of Staff Craig Neighbors, one of the great Army generals at the time, explicitly told the Rangers that they were on probation, and any cowboy behavior out of them would be shut down just like they were shut down after World War II. Conclusion, frame the discussion by keeping in mind the undulations of public enthusiasm for global engagement, let alone for special forces, and the fact that we, to underscore the planning dilemma, really can't count on who our friends and enemies are in the decades ahead.
There was a guy named George Washington who begged our generation of Americans to not be overly entangled in foreign affairs when he let himself get fired.
Which is actually a good segue to you, Rob. You had mentioned kind of making distinctions between real threats and not real threats, like Osama versus Mugabe. And I know that's something you write in your book, powerful piece, that we as Americans, and Tony mentioned this, don't really understand other cultures. And we sometimes misinterpret the threats from other cultures. And I wish you could speak to that, because I think if we had more clarity, we could better make those distinctions.
Yeah, I'd like to actually start by seconding what Tony talked about regarding resources, future threats, as we're easing out of the threat zone. Resources are, I heard Tony's in talk about this water, this huge arable land being destroyed and so forth. So disease, poverty, there's a huge value in doing additional, improved foreign assistance, improved engagement, not entanglement with foreign governments, but simply human decency, making sure that as many as we can, while taking care of our own, are taken care of. Look at our AIDS campaign in Africa, for example. We just went round and round with Congress from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, urging them not to cut the foreign assistance budget from 1% to lower than 1% of the budget. That succeeded, thank God, because it's there. This population, the global population, is especially those who don't live in Europe, where our best pals are, and we exchange media with them and do all kinds of Euro-American activity. There are other populations to the tune of billions who are not privileged to be involved in that media loop, or not privileged to be on the screen and Skyping with us, although there are organizations who are creating the Skyping opportunities. So what I'm trying to get at is that the more we have, the more we are able to leverage our power in non-tactical, non-kinetic, non-war ways, the greater or the lesser our threats will be globally, which are those that are spawned from grievances. Or the grievances that we have very commonly. I've worked in about 34 countries, and I've heard people tell me face to face, they know the Americans are stealing the power out in Kabul. They know the Americans are stealing the power in Baghdad, because they watch us playing basketball at 3 a.m. and drinking lattes from the Green Bean Coffee House, which is the Starbucks of the Middle East, on the U.S. basis. So all that to say that they're wrong. The grievances perceived by the guys in Kabul and the guys in Baghdad are flawed, because the Americans are generating everything on the base at using gas and generators that cost about $50 a gallon, because they import from the U.S. So there's all kinds of fact, there's all kinds of opportunities that we're talking about. I heard earlier, cutting the fat, keeping the muscle. To scope the question back to what Michael was talking about, I want to make sure we're considering the whole universe of potential engagements we can do that help to need less bullets in the future. We just had a great quote by General Mattis. If you don't fully fund state activities, I'm paraphrasing, don't fully fund Department of State activities, I'm going to have to go ahead and budget for more bullets. That's common sense. That's the balance that we're talking about. So to the idea of understanding cultures, Stansfield Turner, page 87 here, I looked it up in advance because I don't remember every page. This goes back into the thing Tony talked about, not understanding our enemy. We need to understand ourselves, and we don't. I argue that, and I perceive that we don't even understand ourselves as a nation. Look at us nationally and ethnically. Look at us racially. Look at us religiously. Look at us by partitioning according to North and South, East and West. There's a massive potential that can come from dignity and respect, internally in the U.S. and externally with the U.S. and other nations. Stansfield Turner, a guy who knew a little bit about intelligence, said a long time ago, I don't think we understood the cultural, historic influences that pushed them into that position, talking about the Soviets and the Afghans and how things developed over there several decades ago. It might have helped us ward the whole thing off if we had understood the deeper currents of the situation. Boom. Understanding cultures is massively important, not only for the U.S. government, but for me personally. The way I engage with individuals on the street every day, the way I engage with Tony over coffee downtown. The way we work together is, it does not have to be an abandonment of one's own identity, one's own values, simply looking to appreciate others. And therefore, what I would summarize by saying, we need to do a lot more effective preparation of blue forces. Those soldiers, those diplomats that are going downrange, or engaging with foreign populations, need to have a more comprehensive comprehension about what's happening in those interactions. Because I talked to corporations recently that their executives are afraid to go to Tokyo or London and come out of their hotel room because they have these fears that are based on ignorance, misunderstanding about the situation they'll be facing. And we have so much more. Finally, in conclusion, General Khudair Abbas was the liaison officer from Iraq to General Petraeus when I was up in Baghdad. He and I would sit down and talk and drink juice, and it came back to the same concepts again and again. He said, Rob, your men are not respecting or trusting my people. My soldiers do not have trust for your guys. Your guys will never have the full value that my guys can bring to them. And that's what I argue for. Common sense, vulnerability, extension of risk, while still maintaining the fact that there are green on blue attacks that happen, and we have to be aware, but not isolated.
If I can jump in there and dovetail with that, is that as we look at trying to figure out what we're going to do with special forces, there's a sort of a transition period here. The next 3 to 5 years, we have a hard time, given the way things work right now, of changing much, even if we can work out a new strategy. So we have a period here for the next 3 to 5 years of trying to figure out what is the best way for the United States to sort of just smooth the waters. And one of the things that you'll find is that the special forces are probably those assets in the U.S. government right now that can best do what Rob is saying. It's not a surefire thing, it's not a guarantee, but the special forces personnel, because of the level of training and because of the level of experience, they have an ability to do a whole bunch of things well that you might not expect. What we need to do as we look at the next couple of years, but we're trying to fill the gap between now and hopefully when we have a real plan, is recognize that the special forces can fill some of those gaps, but then we also need to look at that and say, we don't need to use, we can't squeeze the sponge dry. We have a very valuable asset here that has some very, very unique capabilities that we really don't want to completely expend. We want to keep a little bit, if you will, in reserve. And so as we look around, we need to take a close look at what it is that we really need to do. We need to recognize that there are these very real cultural things that, in fact, the Special Forces guys, writ large, have a better feel for than just about anybody else in the U.S. military as a community, if you will. And we need to be careful about using them for that, but we also need to recognize that they can fill some of those gaps. So you have a very careful balancing act that we need to engage in. We need to recognize that we need to use them to do some of that. At the same time, we need to be very careful that we don't overuse them. We don't expend the asset.
Before you respond to that, sure. Ellie, can you introduce?
Sure. Oh, Arthur Herman from AEI has joined us from head to drive up from Charlottesville. So
that explains it. So I apologize for being so late. We're in Washington traffic now. I'm driving.
Arthur has a new book out called Forging America, which is an extraordinary book. So pleased that he's on this panel.
And this is a topic which is considerable interest to me, both from the point of view of articles that I've written about the war in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, but also because of how I see special ops And I'm so sorry that I missed so much of the discussion, which I'm sure has been fascinating. It may have covered some of these points, I don't know. But the role that special ops plays within sort of the panoply of American military power and force structure. And I guess it's a good thing that I've come in here at the end when we're talking about threats, because what I want to talk about very briefly, a brief outline, is just what I would call the threat of special ops, or rather the threat of an overemphasis on special operations as it relates to American strategy and strategic presence around the world. Keep in mind that special ops now in the future looks very bright. That you're looking at a time when sequester is slashing the defense budget, and when Obama's own 2013 defense budget called for big cuts, that same budget was called for increases in the special operations budget. That the growth, according to the new head of SOCOM, Admiral McCraven, growth, he's looking forward to growth about 3 to 5% a year in terms of personnel. That's a big growth when everything else is shrinking. And it's important to realize, in fact, if I were a small defense or medium defense contractor right now, the place I would look, if I were looking for contracts now that are going to run out and opportunities, I would look for what special operations, special forces needs, because that's the place where there's going to be contracts to be had, and research and technology and development money to be spent. But it's important to realize why it is that special ops is so popular and why it has become so important to force. Basically, its budget's tripled since 9/11. It's extraordinary direction for the defense, for the part of the defense structure to go. First of all, realize that, of course, they're extremely good at what they do. I'm thinking not just of the Navy SEALs, but all of the elements that go into SOCOM. And if I'm going to sound critical of special ops, it's not because I'm critical of the job they do. It's superb. They are extremely mobile, so you can switch them from one theater or from one command to another, basically almost in the blink of an eye here. At any given day, you've got special operations people, personnel operating in about 75 countries. That's covering the globe pretty well. The third thing to keep in mind about is that they are inexpensive. The cost of deploying a SEAL team versus, let's say, a carrier group or a Marine Expeditionary Unit, I mean, there's no comparison. And as a percentage of the defense budget, special operations is a tiny portion. And especially when you team them up with, say, Predator drones, which are also, again, have a great advantage of being very inexpensive. You buy 85 Predators for the price of a single F-22 Raptor. You've got a very good budget-conscious arm of the military that you can use that's competent, that's mobile, and this is an important part of it, I think also the appeal, that operates below the media radar. Right? They're stealthy in all kinds of ways, and one of which is that the media doesn't really find out what they've done and what they've been up to until after it's been done. They go where the TV cameras don't go, and where the embedded reporters don't go. And so, the story that you tell of what they've done and what has happened basically is the one that sticks. And that for presidents who are media shy or Defense Department media shy about incidents that get into the headlines, special ops makes a great investment.
Let me point out something, and it goes back to I think what Arthur was saying, but also what Rob was saying. There's a big danger in planning for special forces over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think the problem within that is the question of nation building. Now, we hear an awful lot about things that, we need to make better appreciation of the Afghan forces. I think we do. But on the other hand, that is a very large part of a much bigger question. The question of nation building altogether, I think, is pretty obviously answered with the idea that it's not a success. We have not had success in nation building in Iraq. We have not had success in nation building in Afghanistan. And we have to ask ourselves whether.
You're going to have anywhere.
Well, exactly, sure. Well, maybe Tokyo. But, the point is.
The Emperor's still in command.
Well, okay. You got me, buddy. But the real point is, we have to understand whether this is a wise investment of special forces. And I would argue it is absolutely not. We need to do more than laze targets and then, shoot bad guys.
But we need to know the limit.
But we not only need to know the limit, we need to know the proper policy, the limitations on a policy. And, you know, again, this may be a little contrarian, but just because George Bush did it doesn't mean it's right. And just because Barack Obama is continuing it doesn't mean he's not just continuing Bush's mistakes. So the real issue to me in budgeting and planning for special operations over the next 5 or 10 years is, do we want to continue nation building? I would argue that.
If I could jump into that real quick, so that backs up some discussions I had with a certain foreign culture on this topic. It goes to your point too. I would argue we should be focused on capacity building regarding whatever capacity, whatever nation we work with, rather than trying to build that nation. Each nation has its own interests, and I think we refuse to actually understand that each nation will always act in its own self-interest, no matter what we want.
I think that's much closer to the concept.
Yeah, and so and I was in discussions, some of you know I went to London to pitch something called Marshall Plan 2.0. I was there last week at this counterterrorism expo. And I had discussions with certain foreign nations that we want to talk about this. Just don't bloody panic. This is millions of dollars. This is actually an enterprise concept where we use banking and private funding to build infrastructure. We the government don't do it. So with that said, I was in discussion with some of these folks, and they said, well, we are all for you helping us build capacity within our country, as long as you don't bring social programs to us. And that point was made readily. It's like, as long as you don't come preaching to us, we're happy to actually accept help to make our infrastructure more resilient. And that was from a foreign national who I will not mention the nation, but it was very clear they don't dig our nation.
If I can throw in one other thing too, and this is sort of down on the weeds, but maybe not. Training special forces guys is very expensive. Training them to the level of proficiency that you see now that they have in Afghanistan in a certain small set of their missions, to sustain that level of performance, and also to essentially bring them back to the appropriate level of performance for the missions that have atrophied during the war on terror, is going to be even more expensive. It's not going to be gigantic amounts of money because they are relatively inexpensive compared to the rest of the DoD. But it does require a focus on their training. And we can do, as we have found out with these kind of units, you can focus on training or you can try and grow the force in size. But you really can't do both at the same time. And that may sound like real simple mechanics, like why can't we have more professional football teams? But the fact of the matter is we tried to grow more SEALs, right, than the big Navy did, right after 2001. And what we found was, that's really hard. It's really, really hard to maintain the quality at a certain level and then also expand it. What you find is you need to essentially expand the entire organization and create more instructors in the whole thing. You just can't add another guy to the class and get an extra SEAL. And so as we look at these very expensive, very capable assets, in the back we have to keep in mind that there is some simple mechanical processes here. And if you want to maintain the skill sets that we see now in the news, and at the same time we want to make sure that they can go back and essentially recoup those assets, those skill sets rather, that have sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit. We can do that. But we can't do that and then also say, well, by the way, we want to do all this other stuff too. And we want to expand the force. We want to stop. At a certain point, you have to say stop. We have to prioritize, figure out what it is we really want to do, what we really want to have as a nation. We sort of focus on that. It's going to require some clear choices. And you can break this system. You know, that there are 2,400 SEALs. That's it. 2,400. Not 2,401, it's 2,400. And if you push this thing too hard, you can break that organization. You could break it really quickly from a bureaucratic perspective. There's a few more Army Rangers, what, about 16,000 forces passed, something like that. But all told, you look at 70 countries and a whole bunch of missions and guys getting deployed for 8-9 months at a time and turnaround training cycle, etc. You go through 20,000 people pretty quick.
See, that's exactly what I'm worried about. This is what concerns me about the growth of this fascination, and even with special ops as sort of the default when it comes to military action. This is what worries me, is that the superlative instrument that it is, that it will allow presidents and foreign policy teams to avoid making hard strategic choices in the future, because they know they can always send in the SEALs. Just like in the 1920s, when we withdrew from the world, we can always send a Marine to fix any kind of little problem. And what worries me, it's like a hospital. It's like a hospital in which you put all of your best talent and all of your best resources in the emergency room. And that is bad for the emergency room people who work there. You can break a system like that, that kind of thing. But it also means the resources that you would need in military resources I'm talking about, that allow you to say, these are the key strategic interests that we have, the key national interests. Because otherwise, what's going to start to happen is that potential adversaries will begin to realize that if we're to face a situation in which we can't rely on SEALs and drones or an occasional cruise missile strike to solve the problem, that we're going to be opting out and disengaging. And that gives them a huge advantage in future potential conflicts and in crisis hotspots.
Two very interesting points were raised during the course of the conversation. One by our historian when he talked about the undulations in history, and I think that's absolutely right. When we talk about threats, obviously threats change. We understand interests, but the threats do vary. And it's important to understand that very important fact. The second is that what has been driving these decisions, as Arthur and Jed have pointed out, are primarily economic concerns, that is, budgetary concerns. And when you deal with budgetary concerns, if you reduce the Marine Corps from 210,000 to 180,000, what does that mean? If you have no idea of how you can deploy those Marines, it doesn't make any difference. It just means that we've reduced it by 30,000. But of course, it's not related to a mission. So that's one of the problems, that what's driving all of these decisions are ostensibly economic concerns, not military concerns, or even national interest concerns. I think that it's important to understand the historical backdrop for almost every one of the conversations that we're having.
Let me jump in here for a moment and speak as an instructor at Fort Bragg. In 1880, I trained Green Beret A-teams. Now, if I were in Congress or a staffer, the key point to remember is that the definition of a special operator and of a special operations force always keeps changing. It changes year by year by year. The top performing conventional forces of today are the special operations forces of 30 years ago. 30 years ago, in the invasion of Grenada, for example, SEALs were not trained to do nighttime parachute jumps into water. That was inconceivable as a regular pointed buzz. Now, nighttime jumps into water are something that Marines do, something that the Army Cavalry even has the option of doing. Today's operators will be the conventional forces of tomorrow. The value that conventional forces have today is that they keep raising the bar all the time for everybody else. And therein is value, but it's not a unique and enduring role for the military overall.
I'd like to speak in favor of jumping into water. I've been injured many times, and I'm glad with that.
Derek, you had mentioned Congress, and obviously we're here with congressional staff. And one thing I want to address is oversight. Oversight, broadly speaking, on the global war on terror, and more specific to the Special Operations Command and JSOC in particular, under SOCOM. There's been a lot of concern among some members of Congress and some of the intelligentsia that a lot of these operations have no oversight. In fact, that Congress has no idea, except for a very limited number, of what's actually happening in our name. And in fact, some of these things might be tactically useful, but strategically blundersome. And I'd like for us to speak here about oversight. Sure.
Well, generally, I think most of the people in special forces regard oversight as one of those instances of please don't help me. But I think that there has to be oversight. And I think other than the case of where you have a presidential determination for a covert operation, I think that there needs to be some openness in that oversight. And having said all that, I'm not sure how the devil you do it. Because Congress, much as we love Congress, it is probably the most unwieldy kind of episode or agency in the United States. I mean, you have, I don't know how many committees and subcommittees overseeing the intelligence community alone. The last count that I had was something like 82. So, that's probably not the right number anymore. Maybe it's 182. But the basic point here is there needs to be some congressional recognition of the methods and means by which effective oversight can be accomplished. And effective oversight means the least micromanagement and the best, well, for lack of another word, management of an asset. And I think we can agree that you have to have the least amount of micromanagement if you're going to have an effective special forces.
Well, if I could jump in, and then I know what Pete's probably going to say. I've testified, obviously, as someone who had to go before oversight committees. And for those of you who remember Able Danger, data mining was the focus of that, but obviously I testified in front of the House Armed Services Committee, not the Intelligence Committee. That's a big clue. A lot of what happens, I would argue, and I agree with you, we need to have a great deal of transparency, especially on things which have already been done. I understand in the planning phase you can't have that. And Pete will back me up on this, I'm sure talk about it. There's a tiered system of special access programs. There's layers of how this works. And I'll say this, while I can't say the things I've done, because they're still classified, Congress knew about everything I did back in the day when I was doing everything. I would go through an annual audit by certain IGs about certain funding streams that I had to take advantage of. So there are methods of doing it. There are best practices. The thing is to emphasize those best practices and then create, I believe, arguably, and I agree with Jed, we can actually have more transparency. Pete, I think you want to take a catch off.
Yeah, no, and let me just chime in what Tony said. Tony and I have had this discussion repeatedly over the years. But I think we're both in agreement here is that the intelligence community in particular, the DoD to a lesser extent, is more to blame for the problems with oversight in many cases than is Congress. This problem is actually kind of getting worse too, because there's a lot of things now the Special Forces guys are doing, particularly the guys at JSOC, that really bleed over into really Title 50 kind of operations. So, intelligence operations. So you wind up with this question mark that actually is growing over time because the specifics of what they're doing are becoming more and more capable from an intelligence perspective, and therefore potentially more and more intrusive into the sort of the daily run-of-the-mill existence that we all go through. And so there is a requirement here as we become more and more capable, we, the DoD, we, the intelligence community, the special forces community, as they become more and more capable, there is a, if you will, there should be a sort of an autonomic response that there needs to be improved oversight because there needs to be something offsetting those capabilities as they develop. Now, that being said, what my experience has been in 30 years in dealing with the intelligence community and other communities in the military, doing a bunch of goofy stuff, is that there is a process to make this work. There are, in those cases where you get involved with really goofy little programs, there are only a few people providing oversight. They take it very seriously, but they are available, they do focus, they do make sure that these things are protected. I've been involved in programs that have never seen the light of day over decades. And if you do it, if you set it up properly, it can work. But it has to be set up properly, and everybody has to agree to play nice in the sandbox. One of the things that I have been witness to over the course of several different administrations is that there is, at the same time, there's an autonomic response that takes place in the White House and the Pentagon that says the guys on Capitol Hill are guns, rules. We can't help them. And there is this immediate recoil. We're not going to. How do we make sure we don't need to share that? Someplace in here, and this all sort of falls on you, because you need to come back and assure the folks across the river, the Pentagon, that you can be trusted. This has to be a working dialogue on both sides of this problem that says, you can trust us, and this is how we're going to make sure that it gets safe, that it's secure, that you can come up and tell us what it is that you guys are doing, and we will ensure that there's both proper oversight and security at the same time. But that conversation has to take place. It has to take place and it has to become more detailed, more comprehensive, because the capabilities are becoming more detailed, more comprehensive.
Actually, I'd like to invite Rob, because I know trust is a big part of your work in Powerful Peace and developing relationships. And you and I have talked offline and maybe online about the silo and the need to get kind of interdisciplinary
Cylinders
discussions.
of excellence.
You might address something else.
Trust, I mentioned earlier about the engagement, having the more robust relationships, either universally or internationally. And trust is essential, as was just described, the lack of trust in the other side of the river from the Pentagon. Now, I would argue, I was going to speak to this anyway, Joe and I talked about it, Joe and I, the smart power guy, talked about how at one point Bob Gates tried to give Hillary Clinton, I think it was $40 billion. He was the guy who said, are we creating more than we're killing? And I quote him a few times in my work, in certain things he did say were right. Some things, I'm sure, there are exceptions. But one was, are we creating more than we're killing? In insurgents or in terrorists? That was a simple comment about the heavy boot, the heavy grit in the environment where we're working downrange. And so he did verbalize that there was much more requirement for state to have capability. Now, I will not argue that state could be more effective because it's a very well-entrenched bureaucracy. No offense to anyone who's involved in the organization. However, it is a very well-entrenched bureaucracy. And just like we can't take a bucket of money and give it to a village elder somewhere and trust that everything will work out fine, and all the needs will be met, and the population in the region, the grievances will be reduced. But rather, we have to spoon it out. We have to have people face-to-face. We're working on programs right now where we actually have biometric capabilities to have people take ATM money out of the local feed, so they're not waiting for the big guy to give them their $500 for the month, which they'll get 100 of. So state, maybe we could give them $40 billion and it wouldn't necessarily make everything better. However, he was trying to do so, cutting a budgetary slice over to her. It went through Congress. This is the way Joe and I talked about it. And in Congress, it was perceived as, well, it's surplus. Nobody wants this money anyway, so let's chop it in half again. Send some of my money to roads in Arkansas, because it's what my people want to help relet me on, and then we'll give $20 billion to the. So we needed to fund and resource the diplomatic, the engagement people better. Coming back around to how that will make the whole system work better, we in SOF are doing village stability operations and other activities like that for two purposes. One, because we're really good at it. Nobody talked about VSO yet, but VSO, village stability operations, is foreign internal development. It's the idea of getting into a local village in Afghanistan, like with the awakening in Iraq, digging in and helping the local authorities to understand that we're here literally to help. We're going to build your skills in defense as well as bring in the civil affairs, bring in the PRT, whatever's in place in that year, and help to develop your economy, your infrastructure. We do that, because we have the versatility. That's why I will argue that SOF should always have non-kinetic skills, because sometimes there's nobody in that entire region of a continent except the SOF guys. Secondarily, we need to have people, that's my prompt, so I need to drink more water. So, I'll drink water after this. Part of the reason we're doing what we're doing in the versatility of soft power all the way to hard power is because we can, and somebody has to be able, the James Bond has to be able to be the guy that does either or in the event that's happening in that week. But we need to get a better inner work, we need to cooperate better, get better trust between DOS and DOD, so that we have a more robust capability on the part of the diplomats who are responsible to go in these environments and help build these things up. And that's something that lacks at the most senior level in the United States. And because of that lack, we're compensating. And because we're compensating, we're being distracted from other tasks that we're good at. And because we're being distracted from other tasks that we're good at, there's a justifiable argument and a criticism that SOF's being misused. So it's a holistic problem.
I suspect when scholarly history of the war in Iraq is found written, that the inability of the State Department and Pentagon to cooperate and how to deal with this conflict is going to be central, starting at the top. And I think that in many ways, what SOF and Special Ops had to do was to sort of take up the slack that was left by a failure to coordinate those two bodies which should have and had more than enough resources had they been able to work out a common strategy on how to deal with that. And that's the kind of thing, I think, a key lesson that's going to be learned when Congress takes another look now at budgets, but also on policy, that one of them is going to find a way to draw those two very different bureaucratic cultures together, state and
I'll help if you want.
Running low on time, so what I'd like to do is open up, see if there's any questions from the folks in the audience. Yes, sir.
I had the privilege about 10 years ago to participate in our workshop, Understanding the Adversary Culture. Knowing who you are and understanding your enemy is very important. This conference was more because we messed up terribly in Iraq. How can we do better? One of the things that aside of is we came and made Iran into better. But the point I want to make is it was both very optimistic to me and also very pessimistic. It was a real uplift that the military, including general and admiral levels, were at this meeting, at least part of it, and the military knew they had a problem. So that's a good start. But it was a real downer because I, as an Orthodox Jew and someone conversant with Semitic history and culture, I knew more than almost anybody else of the several hundred people that were at that conference. There was talk after talk where the speakers demonstrated their abject ignorance of culture, the very thing that we're trying to address. It was really very much of a downer. Even more so, it's the military at least realized they didn't know. They didn't have any idea how to fix it, but they knew they had a problem. The administration is an entirely different level. This is focused on future of special ops, but in general, as far as the national security, how do we get the administration, Congress, and military really together on an overall plan, which is what you raised before? How do we really understand what the combination?
I don't think you can do it. At this stage of the game, I really don't think you can do it. I mean, it's a question that boils down to several things, but first and foremost is the military, as you said, realized that they had a problem. What the hell did they do to fix it? That's the problem, is they didn't do anything. And you have a total disconnect, and whether it's between the culture of the State Department and the culture of the Pentagon, or between the cultures of Afghanistan and the cultures of the United States, these are problems that you're either A, going to resolve, or B, abandon. And there really is no third choice.
Unfortunately, what was done for the most part, in my view, was a middle choice. Okay, we're going to do something, and here's what we're going to do, we're going to spend a major effort on it, but the efforts do to failure. They don't understand nothing. But they do something, and they think they're taking care of it.
Well, we also get lots of process in this town. There's the budget process and the continuing resolution process and letting out contracts and spending money, and you wind up getting wrapped up in a bunch of stuff going on inside the Beltway. Meanwhile, outside the Beltway, there's this giant world out there that's doing things, and there is a cognitive disconnect between the two. And until someone sort of dusts off the table, gets everybody to sit down at the table and sort of think big thoughts, we're going to keep wading through the process and not move forward.
That's part of the problem in this town, is that there's no incentive for change.
Right.
Organizations continue to be funded at the same level through baseline budgeting. Jed talks about this all the time with our friend Jerry Doyle. Baseline budgeting ensures that failure will continue by the fact you're reinforcing failure by increasing its budget every year. There's no incentive to change. Not going to change.
Gentleman behind the auto, and the auto.
What ramifications, if any, do you all see on special ops with this special operator coming forward to talk about Benghazi, and what has up to this point been not discussed?
Is there one? Yes, there's several. Congress is now in discussion with several members who were either witnessed directly, especially the debacle of Benghazi. Some of us have been getting leaks since right after the event of the fact that we had special operations forces available that could have gone in. Now,
And conventional forces.
Conventional forces. By the way, one of the notable things is that we could have had an FBI team on the ground within 24 hours. I was actually briefed by the FBI guys who said, we can halo in. We could have a team on the ground 24 hours. They chose not to send us. We could have secured the crime scene tactically. So there was a lot of things which have not been discussed openly in the media. It's been known in the media, but the media has chosen not to report on it. I think now the whistleblowers coming forward are going to have to require, having been a whistleblower myself, it's going to be painful. There's no guarantees. These guys, if they come forward, their career is over. By the way, just a quick aside on that, Congress wants to do some good, put together some really good whistleblower protection, because the only way you're going to find out your good oversight is when something goes wrong, you have someone who can come out and tell you why it went wrong and what you can fix. But I'm hopeful that we will see some folks coming forward and talk about what really happened.
And last question from Yadav.
Yadav from Congressman Kaufman's office. You gentlemen talked about the use of drones. You also talked about oversight, transparency. Are you all optimistic about the drones being, handled by the DoD rather than the CIA in more instances? You think that's going to be effective, or depends on how it's
I'll
done?
about that earlier. I do think that there is, in my opinion, and my estimate of the military, my weight of my career, I do believe that with the scrutiny, the understanding that, that there's a heavy hand watching over the heavy hand building the drone. Now,
On the DoD side.
DoD side, sorry.
On the DoD side.
Exactly,
Right.
because it's in the care of the DoD.
Right.
It's important to always caveat that drones, this sounds ridiculous, drones don't kill people. Hellfires kill people. So drones, ISR, the eye in the sky that's moving all the time is almost never throwing ordnance onto the ground. It's an extremely important capability for our organization, for our government to have, to be able to watch bad guys. Now, the debate is over sending ordnance to the ground. I argue that, like the nuclear weapon, I was challenged at a conference I spoke at recently. Do you condone the use of drones? And I absolutely do. Just like if anybody in here posed an immediate violent threat, I would condone the use of my putting a bullet in their head. Because there was an essential moment at that event. The drone is the same way, but like we have the capacity for nuclear weapons, nuclear attack, we don't use it. We have it and we don't use it. We should be restraining the use of drones, in my opinion, because the drone is the nuclear weapon in the public media, in the court of public opinion.
Yeah, let me hit that real quick, because I've actually been involved in the legal process. As a matter of fact, for those who have not read my book, Operation Dark Card, the roots of the current process for DoD is actually embedded here. We actually have a list, we have this process, I won't give, it's in the book. So with that said, I think DoD has a much better understanding of two things. First, oversight as stipulated by Rob. I think there's a clear process of delineation between what we're trying to achieve and versus, risk gain and gain loss regarding intel versus assassination. Secondly, along the same line, I think DoD is better at looking at the bigger picture. Right? The fact that when you kill someone, there's second and third order effects. And that's what we pay more attention to than the CIA does.
And there in that process, having, like Tony, I spent 6 months in OIF on the targeting board. And there is a real targeting board, and it is a real board, and we sit there once every 12 hours, we would go through the list, and there was an emerging target board as well, so we had a rapidly emerging target, we had a real process we had to go through, and there were people there, and you ground through the process. You might get through it in 5 minutes, but you actually made sure you actually did the right steps. And so, from a DoD perspective, even when we're doing black ops, we had a black targeting board, and the fact of the matter is we are, if you will, religious about that process. Not to disparage the kids up the river here, but when they want to use a drone, they have a slightly different process, if you will. It's probably not quite as complex or as detailed. That's all I'll say about it.
Or overseen as well.
Or overseen as well. And so there is a very real difference between what's happening when the agency drone puts a round down range and a U.S. drone, a DoD drone puts a round down range. It's almost apples and oranges.
The operators look like cowboys when they roll, but the process is not a cowboy.
Right. And
it's very
strict. And that's something you need to take away from all this is, you see the great pictures of a bunch of tier 1 guys sitting around, they're all dressed up like cowboys and big beards and long hair and
beards save lives.
Huh?
Beards save lives.
That's right. But the fact of the matter is that the planning process that that everyone goes through, and the training and the documentation and the command and control, it is as rigid there and as tightly controlled and as tightly wound up as in any organization in the DoD.
And also, the other thing to keep in mind is that the drone technology is just starting. And we're just beginning what's going to be an explosive evolutionary growth. And I think the DoD is in a much better position to handle that kind of technological growth and see how it integrates with other technologies within the force.
Particularly when you look at like UCAS and truly autonomous air vehicles, they're not drones, there's not someone flying it. You load the mission, you hit the on button, step back, it does things. We were working that process very hard to make sure that that's the type of control.
And so that kind of research and development work, testing and evaluation, I think really belongs in Pentagon hands, not in intelligence.
We're winding down. Elliot's going to conclude, but I just want to make 3 points of things that I'm hearing. One, I think there's a consensus of the need for a national strategy. We lack a national strategy. The second thing is...
Sorry, Michael, holistic economists.
Well, that's a real strategy.
Not just a DOD and a president, a real strategy. Because we need to look at what happens in 10 years or 20 years in a red team perspective that's not based on like my experience in the DOD's red teaming. We need a whole, what might Tokyo look like in 20 years after 1946? We didn't plan around who they would be in 1970s.
So a holistic national strategy. It sounds like we also need some kind of transpartisan process where we can bring all the players together to play nice and actually think through these issues and work on it. And the third thing I heard is the oversight. There seems to be consensus on oversight. Elliot?
First of all, I want to thank Michael for helping put this panel together. It was a fantastic discussion. What it occurs to me, though, is as we have each one of our past, this is the fourth in our series, and each time we have another discussion, it only ends with the need for another discussion. So I think that it's just important. I mean, what was discussed here today is very important, and this is an ongoing series that apparently keeps on, sort of like the government budget, just keeps on expanding and going further. So with that, well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll let you know when the next in the series is. Okay.
Thanks.